the primary thing that convinced us on most of the accounts was the alleged conversation with Russert. It was either false, which some of us believe it never happened, or if it did happen, Mr. Libby saying that he was surprised to hear about Mrs. Wilson. We had about 34 post-it pages, and by post-it I don't mean the little ones you stick on. I mean they were like 2.5 feet by 2 feet, and they were filled with all the information that we distilled from the testimony. And we took a long time to do that. We took about a week just to get all these little building blocks there. And what we came up with was that Mr. Libby either was told by or told to people about Mrs. Wilson at least 9 times. And in a period of time that it would be extremely, I mean, we were told he had a bad memory, and we actually believed he did. But Mr. Hanna's testimony that he would forget from morning to evening who told him something was contradicted by Mr. Hanna's testimony that said he had an incredible grasp of details and arguments, so that even if he forgot that someone had told him about Mrs. Wilson, who had told him, it seemed very unlikely that he would have not remembered that about Mrs. Wilson. So we had all these conversations, the dates when Grossman contacted him about, he had gone to Grossman and said, would you find out about Mr. Wilson? And Grossman came back, and I think those of you who were at the trial heard, he said, well, I thought it was an interesting tidbit that his wife worked at the CIA as well. We have the Joe Wilson article with notation from the vice president on the page saying, was this just a, did the wife just send him on this, whatever it was, junket or something? There were just so many of those things that it was just very hard not to believe that how he could remember it on a Tuesday and then forget it on a Thursday and then remember it 2 days later. Now, having said that, I will say that there was a tremendous amount of sympathy for Mr. Libby on the jury. It was said a number of times, what are we doing with this guy here? Where's Rove? Where are these other guys? We're not saying that we didn't think Mr. Libby was guilty of the things we found him guilty of, but that it seemed like he was, to put it Mr. Wells' point of view, he was the fall guy. Now he made bad judgments.
Was he the fall guy for Vice President Cheney? Was that the belief of the jury?
The belief of the jury was that he was tasked by the Vice President to go and talk to reporters. We never made any, came to any conclusion, or we never even discussed it whether Cheney would have told him what exactly to say.
But what about the motive, as far as the jury's feelings about the motive for Scooter Libby to lie to the FBI and lie to the grand jury? Did the Vice President, Mr. Cheney, come up in your discussions about Mr. Libby's motive?
Was he covering for the Vice President?
We actually never discussed that because that was not what we were assigned to do.
What do you think?
I really don't know. One thing about being on this jury, the people who were on this jury, there were some incredibly good managerial type people who just took everything apart into the smallest piece, put it in the right places, and it got to a point where you just couldn't. Opinion had very little to do with it. You just came to this conclusion that, wow, okay, here it is.
And what about Tim Russert? How credible a witness was he?
Well, I thought he was very credible. I think most people thought he was very credible. But it's a funny thing when there were a few people who thought, no, that he probably had that conversation. So for purposes of arguing that point, we spent I don't know, a day and a half, assuming it was true. At one point, I raised an objection or something about, no, I can't go with that because of X, and somebody in the jury said, wait a minute, you said you don't believe they had the conversation. So, you do get kind of caught up in making arguments for or against something just to help the process along.
What about the Judy Miller testimony? Did you find that to be credible? Did you find it to be important at all?
The Judy Miller testimony was important. I mean, again, we had so many conversations that somebody would say, I don't know, her memory was terrible, and then somebody would say, yeah, whose wasn't? I mean, it was an incredibly show, this whole trial, about just how hard it is to remember things, But the fact that she was so insistent, or said that she admitted she had a bad memory and that she relied so much on notebooks, the fact that she had the notebook entries was, I think it carried a lot of weight, and I think in a way she got badgered, by the defense a little bit, and I think it created some sympathy for her among jurors. Few said things like, "Oh, boy, they really hit on her," but I think she seemed nice or something like that.
Can you tell us about the not guilty count? Which count it was and why you're found not guilty?
I don't really like to say this, but the Cooper count, it was on the conversation with Mr. Cooper and his version of what was said and Mr. Libby's version of what was said, okay?
And was it the perjury or the obstruction of justice?
False statement, yeah. Yeah.
So what was the reaction?
Let me just finish this, okay? And the evidence that he had said, oh yeah, I heard that too, came from Mr. Cooper, and in some part to Kathy Martin, because she had said she was listening to the phone call from one end, but she also said she went away to make another phone call, so that diminished her importance. But Mr. Cooper, so it was basically his word against Mr. Libby's word. Now, so what's the evidence that we saw that maybe favored one or the other? If Mr. Cooper had gotten a affirmation of that information, it seemed unusual that he wouldn't have put that. He had already heard it from Rove, so this would have been his second confirmation. He would have put it in the story he wrote that day. That's one thing. Secondly, he had nothing in the notes about it, so there was no evidence there. There was that kind of trick thing about the sentence. I don't know if you're not familiar with it, you have to look it up. But if he had said, "Yeah, the Libby, the Wilson thing, but I'm not ever sure blank." Now, Wells did that. Took a lot of time to say if this letter was this and this letter was that, and it was not convincing. But it weighed about 6 ounces. And when you looked at that line and you looked at what could it be, the fact that Cooper didn't know what it was, it's just a reasonable doubt.